Welcome back to day 4 of our Southwest road trip, and today we're going to be talking about the place that sparked our desire to head out on this trip, Big Bend National Park in Texas. This marked my first time venturing into the Lone Star State for hiking, which is important because Texas isn't typically thought of having great natural scenery. But in this video, as well as the next one from Guadalupe Mountains National Park, I hope to disprove that narrative. Granted, because Texas is such a big state, you'll have to travel a distance to get here. For us, this meant a 5.5-hour drive south from our previous stop on the road trip in New Mexico. But for most of the folks we talked to, it was closer to 8 hours from Dallas or Houston, and some even drove 12 hours from Louisiana. But you know what? I get it. Big Bend is so spectacular that it warrants a visit no matter where you are in the country. Okay, enough rambling. What the heck even is a Big Bend? Well, Big Bend country is often referred to as the region south of Midland and El Paso, but actual Big Bend is quite literally this big bend on the US-Mexico border. This is where you'll find the more than 800,000-acre Big Bend National Park, which is the 15th largest national park in America and bigger than the state of Rhode Island. Driving from its northern boundary to its southern one right up against Mexico takes 2.5 hours, so it should go without saying, but I would not recommend a single day for this park, especially with all the effort it took to get out here. This is one of the longest drives I've ever done for any one national park, and it feels, and is, damn remote. Now, without further ado, let's waste no more time and discuss our 2 jam-packed days at Big Bend National Park. We woke up absurdly early the first day so we could get a good parking spot at Big Bend's most popular hiking trail, Lost Mine. I want to say we got there at around 7 a.m. and there were just a few spots left at that time. This also meant we got to experience sunrise, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk numbers. The Lost Mine Trail is 4.8 miles round trip with more than 1,100 feet of elevation gain. I think I was under the impression it would be harder than it was, but with views that kept me engaged the whole time, this really seemed to fly by. Saying the scenery was engaging though is a massive understatement. This was the type of stuff that had my jaw on the floor. Lost Mine and several of the other best hikes in the park are situated in the Chisos mountain range, which is one small part of this massive park. But it's also far and away the most visited area, in part because it's the most beautiful by a relatively sizable amount. This was far more lush than I expected, with vegetation all over the mountain's foothills. What I found just unbelievable about the Chisos Mountains weren't its greenery, however, which is already rare in the deserts of the Southwest, but it's also their size and fascinating shapes. The national park's highest point, Emery Peak, is 7,835 feet, but many of the mountains in the Chisos range reach similar heights. Most of the mountains here tend to shoot up like a sword and then flatten out at the top, but then the park's very highest peaks rise even further atop these plateaus. Since it was dark when we drove into the park, I didn't immediately recognize that the Chisos Mountains were kind of made up in layers. Like, the mountains we're hiking up now are themselves on top of others, and you'll get a better idea of what I mean at the end point of this hike. But the entire journey to the top of Lost Mine summit was nothing short of breathtaking, especially with the morning light covering the landscape. Eventually, we made it to this ridgeline, which is where things escalated even more somehow. Just to give you an idea of where I was at, this was probably an 8.5 to 9 out of 10 hike up to this point, but nothing could have prepared me for what was to come. This entire ridge runs along Lost Mine summit at more than 7,500 feet, and what I love about this is there are no barriers to restrict you from going anywhere along its edges. And with how windy it was when we went, I was halfway focused on survival when it came to getting all of my shots and pictures. I never would have expected that earlier scenery to be a tiny little appetizer to the summit views, but that's exactly what happened when things opened up here. There were now 360-degree panoramic views, and every direction left me starstruck. My favorite looked out at distant rolling mountains with this peculiar balancing rock formation at the foreground. This was really pretty on its own with all the moss-covered parts of it, and that color wasn't something I expected. But it's not just greens. Oh no, we're just beginning. Look the other way and you've got mountains that are only coming into view for the first time, and up on its edges are tones of light blue and pink. It's not super vibrant or anything, but neither is Artist Palette at Death Valley National Park, and everyone acts like it's the most unbelievable view in the world. This combined aspects of that with the aforementioned mountain scenery that had already dramatically exceeded my expectations. And that's without mentioning all of the ridges coming off its foothills and the layering from earlier, which is now more apparent than ever. The silhouette effect you get from some of the overlooks in this park compared to some of the craziest examples I've seen in the eastern United States, where all the hills and mountains are comparable in height. And that makes sense given the topography we discussed earlier. But yeah, bottom line is, this hike is unbelievably outstanding and it isn't even all that difficult. I now can understand why this is the park's most popular hike, as it's honestly one of my all-time favorites in terms of pure enjoyment, trail design, and most importantly, scenery. But the crazy thing is, day 2 brought a hike to the table that was as good, if not maybe even a little better, so stay tuned for that. But first, we got quite a bit more to run through, and up next, let's kill some of that elevation on the road down to Chisos Basin. This is the most visited part of the park, home to their main visitor center and a plethora of trails which begin in this valley. The one we'd be going on now was the Window Trail, which is 5.5 miles with 961 feet of elevation gain. However, due to how that elevation is dispersed along the route, it feels mostly flat in my opinion. I'd say this is a bit easier than Lost Mine, but feels quite a lot longer since there's not as much scenery change to keep you entertained. That's not to say the scenery isn't impressive though. This entire Chisos Basin area is really cool because of how it's surrounded on all sides by steep mountains. The little opening you'll see out in the distance is the window itself and is where you'll eventually end up. Like most basins, this was quite dry, and alongside Lost Mine, showcased a lot of Big Bend's natural diversity in of itself. It's more obvious if you visit on your own, but this area really just looks nothing like Lost Mine, especially as you venture towards the window in the second half of the hike. By this point, the mountains narrow in and form these absolutely ginormous canyons with vertical and sometimes even beyond vertical cliffs. Standing under these rocks was honestly kind of terrifying because it felt like we could be crushed at any given second. The peaks all around you get increasingly jagged, and if I had to compare this to anything, I think it would be Cascade Canyon at Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. Obviously a very different type of scenery, but with how you snake your way through these sheer mountain cliffs, it kind of had that same vibe. The canyon continues to narrow in until you feel like you're in a supersized slot canyon. I can't even describe how tall these walls seem to rise, but I remember as I was thinking about that, my expectations were diverted because the size began to shrink. Instead, what you had now were these really unique, intricate formations making up the cliffs, typically blocky, slanted rocks. And the trail design was amazing during this section, as it on itself became blocky steps carved into rock. The trail ends at the exit to the window, which is a tiny little slot canyon with a steep drop-off on the other side. Do not screw around here because if you go to the end and slip, your life is over. I enjoyed some different angles and perspectives from a distance, and noticed this absolutely massive pinnacle shoot up out of the ground on the other end. The vertical formation almost mimics the part of the window that isn't filled up by rock. All in all, a fascinating end to a rock-solid hike, pun intended. Oh, and I feel inclined to mention that we saw a fox on the way out, which was awesome. You'll hear me talk a little more about wildlife later in the video, but also I must have saw hundreds of these unbelievably stunning little bluebirds while I was in the park. Anytime I saw these guys, I stopped and was enamored by their color. The way back was a fair bit more strenuous than the way out, as you have to gain some elevation on those switchbacks at the beginning, and I don't think this was actually that hard. It was more that it just felt unbelievably hot since we were in this basin and there's nowhere for the hot air to escape but up. Anywho, we had one more hike on our agenda for day one, despite our legs, which were so tired after hiking more than 10 miles. That's the Grapevine Hills Trail to Balanced Rock, which can be accessed by a gravel road. Now, even though we had a two-wheel drive vehicle, the expectation was we would make it just fine because most non-paved roads in national parks are very nicely maintained. And while the first mile or two weren't that bad, the other 4 we had to go were just too unbearably bumpy for an old sedan like the one we were driving. Therefore, we made the executive decision to turn back around, and I'm so glad we did. Stick with me here, guys. Look, I was feeling pretty bummed that we weren't going to be able to do one of the more popular hikes in the park, so I got the idea to park at the entrance road and wave someone down so we could hitchhike to and from the trailhead. At first, my buddy Evan, who is quite a bit more responsible than I am, was like, no way, we can't do that. And in his defense, that rational thinking is what got us through the trip. But I said, trust me on this, let's wave down one car and just see what happens. Well, on the first try, an older married couple from Louisiana stopped over, said they would have been happy to take us, but that they didn't have enough room in their truck. Then they asked, do you want to get in the trunk? And I was like, you know what? Hell yeah, let's go. I don't have a lot of footage to share from this, but this is a video from Snapchat where we were just thinking, what the hell is life? A little over halfway through the road, things got super rough, and we were like flopping around in the trunk thinking to ourselves, if we had sent it with our sedan, we would have been completely screwed. I am still incredibly grateful to that family and was glad to join them for a hike. They were probably some of the nicest people I have ever met. The Grapevine Hills Trail was definitely the driest and most desolate part of the national park we saw, looking straight out of Joshua Tree or Death Valley from the deserts of California. But it was still really cool as you had all these little pinnacles working their way up tiny buttes sandwiching the trail. Altogether, this was a little under 2 miles round trip with 246 feet of elevation gain, and nearly all of that elevation hits right there at the end as you climb your way up one of those buttes. Up until this point, this is an extremely straightforward hike, but it became a little too much for the wife at the end there, which is why she stopped and waited for us at the bottom. The husband, who was in his 80s, absolutely killed it, however, and if he can make it, so can you. So so keep pushing. The end result first were these really cool views looking down into this canyon to hike through the entire time, but also a large balanced rock formation. Even though it was swarmed by people when we got there, I was thoroughly impressed seeing as it was held up by two steep rock stacks and kind of looked to be sliced in half by the squiggly line. And its location was also cool atop this drop-off where on the other side you can look out and see endless badlands making up the park. Also cool was by waiting long enough we managed to catch it with no one around, making it far easier to enjoy and take pictures of. Prior to the actual balanced rock itself, I probably wouldn't say the stress we had gone through made this hike worth doing, but when everything was said and done, I was glad to make it out here. I wouldn't go super far out of your way to do it. Remember, a big part of it for me is capturing these spots for my videos, but if you pull up in a bulky four-wheel drive Jeep or something, sure, you may as well. Now, that's gonna do it for day 1 in the national park, but before we move on to day 2, I can't in good conscience not talk about dinner that night. Right outside the park, in the tiny little town of Terlingua, is the Starlight Theater. This is one of the most unique culinary experiences I've ever had, and it shows because there's always a long wait to experience it. These are all people that have the same idea to come right after they're done in the national park, but also remember there's not much else out here. We waited in this long 45-minute line just to confirm a table for ourselves another hour later, and in that time we checked out some of the shops jointly connected to the building and ate out at a nearby ice cream shop. When our time was ready, I began to realize why this place was so popular, as it's not so much about the food, but rather the atmosphere. There are always performances going on to keep you entertained while you wait for your food, and the scene was exactly what I could have hoped for in this part of Texas. I read a lot of reviews beforehand that said the food wasn't anything special and that it was all about the vibes, but I actually don't agree with that. We both got burgers and the brisket in mine I thought was fantastic. Exactly what I needed to wrap up an intense but phenomenal day in Big Bend National Park. On day 2, we once again got up bright and early, but not quite as early as the day prior, because we were going back to the Chisos Basin section of the park, which has a pretty big parking lot. This is so we could embark on the South Rim Trail, by far the longest hike of the trip at more than 12 miles with 2,400 feet of elevation gain. This one's a grind, but it's also absolutely spectacular, so stick with me as we dissect every last second of this trail. First of all, it's worth noting that you can customize this loop to be as short or as long as you want, but here's the thing. A visit to Big Bend without hiking all the way to South Rim is a big missed opportunity. Let's not jump the gun though. The trail begins right alongside the window trail and much to my amazement had some of the best views we saw looking out into the window. Just like yesterday, hiking through the Chisos Basin is awesome, getting to see these monolithic mountains all around you, but unlike that experience, you'll now be climbing up above them. Remember how I mentioned the expansive flat tops of the peaks here? Well, that's more apparent than ever by the time you conquer this uphill battle consisting of seemingly endless switchbacks. But on the bright side, your views do seem to get better and better over time as the trees randomly open up and reveal more distant peaks. In my opinion, it gets really amazing once you start to peer above the peaks surrounding Chisos Basin, as you just feel like you're on top of the world. All the unique rock formations making their way down the mountain's foothills were so cool and really make up for the fact that you'll be huffing and puffing for a while. But here's what I'll say about the South Rim Trail is once you're done with all this uphill, the rest of the elevation you traverse feels very gradual. Obviously it sucks at the beginning, but you've got to look at these behemoth hiking trails with a different lens because that 2,400 feet of gain is spread across 6 miles one way. Following this, Big Bend's ecosystem seems to change entirely, from desert to plains, with all these yellow bushes which remain prevalent the entire time you're on top of these mountains. It's really pleasant, but there's not much to show you guys since the scenery doesn't change a whole lot until you reach the South Rim. But nothing can quite prepare you for how absolutely unfathomable the scene is about to become. You're now at the southern edge of the Chisos Range, standing atop sheer cliff and out over countless badlands from 5,320 feet high. I've seen lots of badlands around the world and these are unlike anything I've ever seen. You know the saying everything's bigger in Texas? Well, these in fact are larger than any badlands I've seen. And it looks like they go on forever and ever, and when you can just start to make out what's on the other side of them, it's even more mountains, but this time in Mexico.
Yeah, you can't get the scale of this, it's just crazy. Just unbelievable. And way out there is the canyon, Santa Elena Canyon. That's so cool.
That is incredible.
Yeah, South Rim was amazing.
It just felt like time froze as we kept walking along the rim to enjoy all sorts of different perspectives. And while we're at it, I feel like I've got to put more emphasis on the rim itself because what kind of sci-fi alien planet are we walking on here? The only other time I've seen a landscape slanted like this was at Capitol Reef National Park in Utah, but this is different because now we're actually hiking along that slant to continue the trail. As if this moment couldn't have gotten more epic, a fellow hiker told us he had spotted a black bear nearby. Sadly, we never ended up seeing it, but it's still worth noting that this is the one part of the park where they're incredibly common, and that adds a lot to the already stellar variety of wildlife visible in this park. As we made our way further on the trail, and I know I speak for Evan also, could not put our cameras down, not as long as our eyes were in the direction of this mind-boggling scenery. I've had it trying to put this into words. South Rim provides what is undeniably the single best view in all of Big Bend National Park. And while we had already decided all of the effort on this hike was worth it just for this, the crazy thing is it keeps going and the journey back is more beautiful than the journey out. It starts the same with that plains-like scenery in every direction, but I counted more instances this time where the view would open up and reveal cool rock features. For example, one of my favorite parts of the entire hike was this interesting balanced rock with an absolutely crazy backdrop of some of the Chisos range heading in the direction of Lost Mine. Then losing all the elevation you gained earlier by traversing similar switchbacks to the basin was awesome. Obviously it's considerably easier going down, but I'd also say the rock formations were more abundant and came in even more fascinating shapes than before. These pinnacles seem to follow the mountainsides all around you, and for the remaining duration of the hike you'll be engaged by them. Lots of cool angles to be had, and try to focus on that and only that, even if your feet and legs are in agony. South Rim, while the most strenuous hike of the trip, could not have been more worth it. In the moment I thought it was pretty amazing, but now looking back at it, I actually think it's even better than I thought. I get that some individuals might not be physically capable of doing this, but if you are, everyone should dedicate a whole day to exploring this area in Big Bend National Park. Hands down, another one of my all-time favorite hikes alongside Lost Mine. From here, we'd be saying goodbye to the Chisos Basin and heading south to the Ross Maxwell Scenic Drive. The 30-mile road contains many new sections of the park we hadn't seen yet, and I can appreciate just how many cool pull-offs there were to enjoy. I don't have too many names to share of the viewpoints, but I will quickly point out some of the unique features we saw on the way. First was this spot, which looked into the window from the outside of the Chisos Mountains.
We were right there.
Sotol Vista Overlook was cool in that it was situated kind of in the inside of the Badlands from earlier, and it's also prominent in that it's one of the few named stops that also happens to feature a sizable parking lot. After this, we drove deeper into the park's desert horizon and got to see some surprisingly colorful rocks on the sides of the mountains. Goat Mountain was our favorite with its faint hues of blue and green, but there were also plenty of examples of whites, reds, and purples. I enjoyed this pull-off too, looking out at these twin rock formations called the Mule Ears, and then made one last stop as we neared our final attraction near the US-Mexico border. This overlooks the Rio Grande River, which actually makes up the border of the two countries. It's fascinating to think you could pretty easily swim or rock hop across, but there wouldn't be a point as long as this massive vertical rock wall exists. While the river officially separates the two nations, this feels more like a border because there's literally no way over it. And then carved into the sheer cliff is Santa Elena Canyon, which is Big Bend's most iconic spot, and for good reason. The canyon spans 8 miles long and most impressively reaches heights of 1,500 feet. There's a pretty cool viewpoint of its mouth, but my favorite perspective was actually standing at its mouth along the Rio Grande. To get here, you'll want to venture onto the Santa Elena Canyon Trail, which is 1.6 miles round trip with 219 feet of elevation gain. This is the easiest hike we did in the park, and that's a big reason it's also the most visited. That said, I think this is one of those places that would be popular even if you had to trek 5 or 10 miles to access it. That's how indescribably large and impressive it is, with the iconic river view towards the beginning of the trail. After this, you'll have the ability to walk through a big chunk of it, and this was equally as amazing. I know I've spent this entire video raving about how awesome and big things are here, but I really mean it for Santa Elena Canyon. This is so stupidly tall that you'll struggle to make out any difference between it and the inner canyon hiking at Grand Canyon National Park. My neck was absolutely killing me by the end of our visit solely because I couldn't stop looking up. I've run out of adjectives to use that could accurately describe what it's like to be here, but what I will say is this stand-alone location exceeded my expectations more than almost anywhere I've ever visited. And the fact that it's not even in my top 2 for favorite things in the park is unfair. An absolutely unbelievable finish to one of the best national parks I've been to anywhere. What else can be said about Big Bend National Park that hasn't already been said? It's not only the most beautiful area in Texas, but I think it's one of the most beautiful in the country. I'd also go as far as to say it's the most underrated national park I've been to, even though its visitation numbers are probably quite a lot higher than the other contenders. Yeah, the trip was worth it just for this, but believe me, there's still lots more to come as we head back towards New Mexico. Thank you, Big Bend, for an unforgettable 2 days, and for those of you watching who have never been, start packing your bags. Like, I'm basically tempted to just get up and do it right now.
Big Bend National Park was one of the highlights of the trip. That Lost Mine Trail, oh man, that was absolutely amazing. Just the lighting, getting up to that top and that viewpoint. It was one of the few times in nature where I've been absolutely speechless. That was just so cool. The window trail, that was really neat. The Indian area with the canyon, as well as the window itself was really neat. That whole Chisos Basin area is just so freaking cool. And then the balanced rock was a little disappointing, but the adventure to get out there, that was really fun. Then the South Rim Trail we did the next day, that was, oh man, that was so cool. The actual South Rim viewpoint was amazing. The trail itself, while long, was still really interesting and had a lot to see. And then the Scenic Drive, that was really cool to see another kind of area of the park that was very different than the Chisos Basin area. And then of course Santa Elena Canyon, that was, oh man, that was so cool. That's the most iconic thing in the park, and that absolutely delivered. So overall, Big Bend National Park was absolutely amazing. It's definitely up there with like the other major national parks as one of the best in the whole country. So I know it's out there, but it's definitely worth doing, and I'm glad I got a chance to go.
Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my final national park visit of 2024. If you did, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Travel Dash for more content like this in the future. Until next time, I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out, guys.